So on a day-to-day basis, all organisations will be dealing with some degree of that kind of threat.
What are you seeing?
Tools being used for good and bad. I think organisations assume that if there's a cyber attack of any size or scale, the security team will ride in on a white horse and save the day. That's just not true.
The training and development is a key part of that.
91% of attacks start with a phishing email.
Mark Wantling, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Decisive and commercially astute senior leader with a record of achievement in leading IT operations through transformation, Mark Wantling is Chief Information and Infrastructure Officer at the University of Salford. Mark is a highly effective leader with a passion for developing relationships and delivering change in partnership with the business and organisation around him. Shaping strategy, translating into delivery and implementing large-scale change, Mark is responsible for the university's physical and digital infrastructure, including the campus master plan, which I have to add is very impressive. Welcome, Mark.
Wow, what an intro.
Oh, thanks for coming. I'm so excited to have you here today to talk about, let's start with, we hear CISO and what was CISO and cybersecurity and AI. Could you just kind of give us a whole run through that, please?
Yeah, of course. So CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, and usually is the most senior role from a security perspective within any organisation. You quite often find them in kind of medium to larger enterprises. Scale of smaller enterprises tends to mean they don't have that specific role, but there'll be somebody in a small organisation playing that kind of role. Now, there's two ways of looking at the CISO role. I think more traditional view is that they're there to keep the organisation safe, and so the perception can be that the CISO is a bit like the police. They're there to make sure you don't do bad things. They're there to protect the organisation and keep everybody from doing something pretty stupid that might impact the organisation. Actually, more recently, I think the thinking of a CISO role is actually to enable business. And what we're seeing more and more now is actually consumers and customers are making more informed decisions about their purchases based on the organisation. So actually now we're seeing consumers not just look at what type of product does an organisation sell, but they're also interested in some of the ethics behind that organisation, the sustainability credentials of that organisation, and increasingly now the ability for that organisation to keep their very sensitive personal data safe and secure. So the CISO role kind of wraps all of that up and now is more seen as a business enabler and actually is more visible probably to the consumer than ever before.
So really important for business leaders to kind of have some kind of skill set within their organisation. You mentioned keeping the business safe. Safe from what?
So there's a whole array of threats out there. The University of Salford, the number one risk on our risk register is the risk of cyber attack. Now, actually, we're defending at any one time from probably three particular types of groups of threat actors. They're people who would see us, do some damage to us in some way, shape, or form. So we've got the very kind of traditional cyber criminal, I suppose, and they're the people that are looking really for monetary gain from an attack on an organisation like ours. So they would target us with things like ransomware, where they would encrypt our data, steal our data, and then demand a payment in return for that data. So that's a very traditional kind of cyber attack. So that's one group of threat actors. We've then got nation-state sponsored threat actors. So probably very pertinent given the kind of geopolitical climate at the moment. Nation-states attack each other. Nation-states try to get information from each other, sensitive information. And sometimes universities come under the purview of those attacks from nation-states, either intended or otherwise. And so we have to protect sometimes from state-sponsored attacks. That could be from big countries like China, for example. It could be from North Korea, it could be from Russia and others. So there's another big group of people that might be looking to steal sensitive data from an organisation, not just a university. And then we've got the kind of insider threat, the people within the organisation that may either deliberately or inadvertently cause some harm to that organisation. That could be divulging a password, it could be succumbing to a phishing email, for example, or it could be deliberately leaking that information. So on a day-to-day basis, all organisations will be dealing with some degree of that kind of threat. To give you a kind of sense of scale, We receive probably around about 100,000 attacks a month at the University of Salford across all of the plethora of those 3 different threat actor groups. So we're constantly trying to manage and defend against different types of attacks and scenarios.
So is it almost like a war room is set up and you've got people working there in front of screens watching what's going on and making sure that we don't click on the wrong link?
Exactly that. So we're constantly monitoring for trends, patterns. Every attack group has a certain type of attack that they use, certain techniques, and we monitor for those fingerprints, for want of a better description. We're looking for signs of entry, and if we find them, then we go and close those down. We're also looking and constantly probing our own perimeter and our other vulnerabilities to try and see if we can spot something before a bad actor might. So we're constantly probing our own network, our own devices. We're constantly testing our own staff and students to see if they behave in the right way. So we might send a phishing email that's a simulation, not a real threat actor, and it's to test that our training is effective for our staff and students. So we're constantly watching for a breach and hoping that there isn't one, but if there is, closing it down quickly. Constantly testing our own defences to see how quickly we react to those kind of incidents, and we're constantly trying to train our staff and our customers and our staff and student base to better identify the types of attacks that we may experience.
I'm conscious that I'm speaking to the CIO here, but in my defence, I was really busy. But an email came in and I had numerous deadlines to hit. And this email, when I glanced at it, and it sounded like somebody I'd been working with on a project, and it sounded like him. His personality came through, the text and everything. So I just responded to that email.
Yeah.
What I inadvertently had clicked on a phishing email.
Yeah.
Now, the level of sophistication in that email, it was as if he was talking to me through that. The tone of voice, the pace at which it was written. So we're seeing a level of sophistication now, and there's a lot of hype around artificial intelligence. What are you seeing?
So I guess you can't have any conversation these days without AI featuring in that. And years ago there were a number of organisations that I guess traditionally said we're not an IT business, for example. Well, now every business is an IT business. IT enables every organisation across the globe now to transact in some way, shape or form. AI has then been the next revolution of digital business. And so what we're seeing is AI tools being used for good and bad. And what you described there potentially is the use of artificial intelligence, generative AI, to craft higher quality phishing emails. So generative AI, large language models can be trained on data. That data can be used then, or that model can be used for good or bad purposes. One of the big trends we're seeing in cybersecurity is a higher quality of phishing email from threat actors, from bad actors, because they're now no longer making the spelling mistakes because English wasn't their first language when they were previously having to craft those emails themselves. Or punctuation is more accurate, again, because they're not having to craft those emails themselves anymore. So what they're now able to do is train large language models with lots of email content and then use that to generate higher quality phishing emails. So it may appear to be very genuine, because we've constantly trained people in the past to look for phishing emails where there were spelling mistakes, or the use of language was slightly off, or the grammatical elements of the email may not be quite right. That's not true anymore, because large language models, generative AI, is well trained on all of those things, so it doesn't make those mistakes. Perversely now, what we might actually be training people to look for is emails that are too perfect, where there are no mistakes, where there are no spelling errors, where the language flows really smoothly and there's no use of colloquialisms, for example, and things like that. So actually now we've got almost the flip side of the challenge with phishing emails, where we need to look for perfect emails, where that probably doesn't exist when it's been written by a human.
So this innovation in AI, GenAI, cybersecurity, and the intersection of, why is that important, and why does every business owner need to be having this conversation?
So like everything, there's light and dark, isn't there? So there's good sides and bad sides to development, whatever that development might be. And AI is the same. So organizations can leverage AI to drive efficiency, for example. One of the big gains from generative AI is it can do a lot of the heavy lifting, for want of a better description, in lots of process type organizations. So for example, we're starting to use generative AI to produce minutes of meetings. We don't need somebody in that meeting anymore to type some notes. We can just get generative AI to record the session. It will produce the notes, it will produce a summary. We're using it to produce content, for example. It can create really nice pictures and images and videos and so on. So it's really positive for pretty much every business. There is some opportunity in terms of efficiency and use of AI across every business. Generative AI is creative. You can ask it to generate images. So marketing teams can use generative AI now. They're not having to go to designers or design studios and spend huge sums of money anymore. So it's transforming business in that way. And they're all the positives, and there's loads more positives from generative AI. We're using generative AI in cybersecurity to help defend against attacks. So we're using GenAI as a force multiplier within our cybersecurity teams. So I mentioned 100,000 attacks, give or take, across the university every month. We have 5 people in our InfoSec team. You don't have to be able to do the math to work out that's a lot for 5 people to be able to do. But if we can train a generative AI model to weed out the types of attacks we've seen before and deal with them automatically, and then we can use GenAI to surface the really important urgent attacks that need a human to put hands on a keyboard to deal with. So GenAI for us in cyber is being used as a force multiplier. If we think then more about the dark side, and we might talk a little bit more about this, it can be used in lots of negative ways. So it's been used to create higher quality phishing emails, for example. So businesses need to understand that there's a huge benefit here that AI brings, but there are some negatives, and particularly in a cybersecurity space, any new technology will be exploited for that negative, and that's what we're seeing come through now.
Let's home in on that dark side, because we've heard of the dark web, and what, in your experience, are you seeing happening on the dark side of AI and cybersecurity?
I guess there's a couple of things. So people unfortunately assume that if a tool is published out there, let's take ChatGPT for example, but any other large language model, there's an assumption that it's safe and secure. And we've seen simple mistakes that, this is not even necessarily the dark side of it, but just people not understanding the policies around some of these tools. So we have seen people uploading personally identifiable information into some of these tools. But once it's uploaded, then we have no control over that data anymore. So there's an information security risk there that data may be used elsewhere. Classic example is DeepSeek. So a generative AI model developed in China. If you look into their policies around data, what it actually says is if you use that tool, they will store personal data. They will store data from chat history that you share with that tool. They'll store data about your device from that tool as well. And that data will be stored on servers in China and may be shared with the Chinese government for its own purposes. So people can be using DeepSeek, for example, with the best of intentions, but actually if they're not informed about how that tool uses that data, they could be giving up very sensitive data to the Chinese government. So there's an awareness piece, I think, that needs to happen. Then we've got things like data poisoning. So, some very clever people have worked out that AI is trained on data models.
So you feed it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can feed it any data you like, and there's certain techniques to be able to do that, but you can feed it erroneous data. And so then the output from that data when people query the tool is not entirely accurate. So again, take DeepSeek as an example. That's been trained on data derived from China and largely the Chinese government. When you query that tool, there's certain historical inaccuracies in there. So, for example, we know that in China, if you are over there and searching for certain historical events like Tiananmen Square, it isn't in the history books. It doesn't feature within DeepSeek. So actually anyone using that tool to ask questions about historical events or even political information will get a slightly skewed version of that. So there's a risk that people using those tools take the information as it comes and just assume that it's factually accurate, when actually it can either have been deliberately or inadvertently manipulated in the background. So it's not always entirely accurate.
So this could be said for any Gen AI tool that we're all using regularly now.
Exactly. So there's a great example there where, so you go, okay, well, DeepSeek was built in China. maybe that's obvious that there's going to be some contention from the West about the use of that type of tool. But take ChatGPT. There is a tool that you can buy on the dark web called WormGPT, and you buy that tool, and that allows you to circumvent the guardrails that ChatGPT has in place. So you can purchase that tool for very little money, a couple of $100. By using that tool, you get around those guardrails that exist. So then you can start to get ChatGPT to do things it was not designed to do. That could be crafting malware, for example. So you could actually ask, once you've bought the relevant tools to be able to remove those guardrails, you can ask it to do quite nefarious things. So you could start to use ChatGPT to create malware to attack others. You could start to use ChatGPT to do data discovery and start to extract data from organizations as well. So there are now AI tools designed to remove the guardrails from those tools.
It sounds like there's a whole new industry, well, not even new, industry set up that works on the dark side.
Yeah.
Rumour has it, and I don't want to give away any kind of state secrets here, but you have a very innovative way of getting C-suite to listen to what you need for cybersecurity and why they should invest.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little about what you do?
Yeah, of course, I'd love to. So again, traditionally, I think organisations assume that if there's a cyber attack of any size or scale, that the IT team, the security team, will ride in on a white horse and save the day, and that's just not true. There's a lot of statistics out there about security professionals now being overworked, working way too long in the day. That's leading to mistakes that can then lead to breaches in themselves. So cybersecurity industry professionals, I think, are pushed to breaking point, frankly. And I think that's because there's this assumption that the cyber team will just rescue the organization every time there's a breach. Now, actually, that's not true, and what we need to do is encourage the whole organisation to understand it's everyone's responsibility to play their part in a good, safe, secure organisation. Unfortunately, that doesn't always start from the top down. Again, that kind of behaviour can be seen at the top, where there's an assumption around that top table that IT will save the day. So one of the things that I did a couple of years ago was start to question, well, why do the board, for example, not understand that this is a massive risk and that we need to do something more proactive about it? Why might I not be getting the level of investment that I think is required, and why don't they understand the risk? And I realised I just wasn't sharing enough information with them. They saw it on the news, but people see lots of things on the news, and that doesn't necessarily mean it lands with them. So how do I make that a bit more real? So what I did was took the board on a tour of the dark web. Now, when I say a tour, we went into the dark web and we looked at data for sale. So I showed them things like Netflix accounts, PayPal accounts for sale. We saw credit cards for sale. So there's dark web marketplaces where you can buy a credit card with a balance of, say, £2,500. That will probably cost you $200 to buy that credit card. Now, clearly what you're buying is a stolen credit card there. So somebody's details have been taken online somewhere, and then that information has been checked. It's been proven to be working. The balance has been checked on there, and it's now for sale for $200. So I showed them that, and I showed them the kind of mechanics in the background of that. So using cryptocurrency protects your identity. There's this thing on the dark web now called escrow, where just as in the US, when you're buying a house, there's a middleman. They hold the cash, and they hold it to make sure that you receive your goods. So we explained that. We went through that with them. Then I had a look at some dark web marketplaces. So these are the real kind of more seedy side of things, I guess, although it does get worse than that, but quite seedy, where there's drugs for sale. And it's just like any online marketplace. So you can go and look at the seller's history. You can see how many items they've sold.
Reviews?
Reviews on there, yeah.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
There's a particular dark web marketplace, which I won't name, but rather than a 5-star rating, the stars are pills. And it sells drugs, and you get 1 to 5 pills depending on the quality of your service. You can pick the type of shipping that you want on there, just as if it was any other marketplace. You can choose which type of cryptocurrency you want, Monero, Bitcoin, etc. You can pick and choose. You can vary the quantity of drugs that you buy. So that's, we went on this journey with the board. This is credentials for sale, cheap, easy to buy. We looked at a dark web marketplace. Then we got into more of the cybersecurity side of it. So there's a role within threat actors called an initial access broker. The people who are initial access brokers, their role is to break into an organisation. But at that point, they stop. And what they do is sell the access, hence being an initial access broker. We've seen over the last couple of years in particular, that role increased massively. 50% increase in initial access broker adverts on the dark web in the last year. So I showed them that. And in the initial access brokers list, it will list out a number of servers. And you can filter by country. So you can look at servers in the UK. You can look at things like IP addresses and area. So I filtered on UK, Manchester. And there were 40 or 50 servers where access was being sold to those servers or to those organisations. And the access was around about $50, so really cheap. Then we went all the way and we looked at some ransomware gangs. So these are the gangs that break into organisations, encrypt their data, and then hold that data hostage and hold the organisation hostage. And I showed the board that information, and I showed them some universities from around the world that were now being held hostage and had their data. I showed them some accounts for sale. Interestingly, some of the accounts were board level, and I filtered on chief finance officer. And the accounts for sale for this chief finance officer, it said UK organisation, around about £250 million a year business, and the CFO's username and password were for sale for $250. And you could see my CFO instantly sit forward and go, wow, is that all I'm worth?
Personal and relevant.
Exactly. Yeah. So they started to understand that whole journey and how it can go from just a click on a phishing email through to some data being on the dark web leak site, being held ransom and facing multi-million-pound ransomware demand.
So at that point, you've grabbed their attention, and obviously they have to invest, right? So this is where any organization needs budget in order to get the skills, but also the software and the hardware to make it work. So at that point, how are you then? You've shown them the threat.
Yeah.
They realize the threat. What happens next in the conversation?
So that's the really interesting bit, because then they say, great, what do you need? Now it's on you to make it happen. And so I guess I'm painting a bit of a target on my back by going, here's the size and scale of the risk. You now understand it. You can't ignore it anymore. But now here's all the things that I need to be able to defend against the threats that I started off talking about earlier on. So then there needs to be a program, and that program needs to cover everything from, do we have the right detection tools, for example? Do we have the right monitoring tools? Can we see when things are going wrong? So, for example, we now can automatically monitor for if any of our usernames are for sale on the dark web. As soon as a University of Salford email address is advertised on the dark web, we get a notification. We can then trace that back. Where did that come from? Was it because of a breach within the university? Was it because somebody clicked on something they shouldn't have? And so we've got the monitoring in place now. We've got monitoring that looks at impossible travel. So what we quite often saw in the past was accounts would log in, and let's say, Miraj, it was your account, and you logged in Salford at 7 o'clock in the morning. If that account then logged in from China 2 hours later, that's just not possible, is it? You know, it's just physically not possible for you to travel that distance. We now receive alerts when things like that happen, because that's a sign that your account has been compromised. So we've got the investment in, can we spot things that are happening? Can we then use the tools that we've got to defend against those things? Can we spot more advanced patterns of behaviour? Can we see those things coming? And interestingly, can we protect internally? So insider threat is a growing risk. There's a really interesting approach from a gang actually based out of North Korea. They've innovated in their attack vector. So what they did was North Korea have got a big focus right now on let's say cash generation, a pipeline for money into the country. They're being really restricted by a number of kind of restrictions that are put on them from across the globe at the moment. And what they're doing is looking to try and generate more cash as a country. So they came up with this idea of kind of a lot of IT people within the country starting to apply for jobs in organisations across the globe. And so a lot of these people from North Korea maybe moved to, say, China or some other countries in the vicinity, and they would apply for remote jobs in normal companies, normal organisations, small, medium enterprises, as software developers, IT engineers, I think because of COVID-19, there's been a significant increase in remote working. So these jobs largely were remote based. The CVs that they submitted were created by generative AI. The images were created by generative AI. The whole interview process, questions were responded to by using generative AI. And these people were successful in securing jobs, IT jobs in normal organisations. And when the company then said, great, you've been successful, we'll send you out a laptop. And they would intercept that laptop and it would go and sit in a server farm, usually in China, sometimes in Russia and other organisations. And then the hacking team from North Korea would dial into those laptops and hack that institution, that organisation. They're no longer having to break in. They've been given a laptop.
They've got access.
They've got a username and password. And if you pick the right role, IT, development, security, whatever,
you're in the back end.
You're in already.
Yeah.
So that's been going on for some time now, and we've seen that just evolving just a little bit more. More recently, we've seen them kind of sometimes going, don't bother sending a laptop. I'll use my own device. Just give me the username and password. So they're now not even having to intercept
Bring
a
your
laptop.
own device.
They're just exactly. The hackers are bringing their own device, and so that interesting bit of innovation out of North Korea, different way of operating. Why try and break the front door down when actually just go for a job interview at the organisation and they'll give you access in the first place? So really interesting, just innovation in kind of different ways that different cyber criminals are working now.
You've got the budget now, and how do you go about? You've looked at the tools and the software that you need, teams, the skill sets. How do you then go about finding the right people to work in a department? You mentioned you got 5 people in your kind of front there.
Recruitment is tough in cybersecurity. I mean, different organisations have different levels of risk appetite, for example. And so if you look at the financial services sector, their risk appetite is very low. You look at startup organisations, they have quite a high risk appetite. As a university, we're somewhere in the middle, probably slightly left of centre, more towards the financial services, but not quite at that scale. But that means that when people come and work for us, we tend to take them early on in their career. And we try to recruit people that we see something in them, some kind of drive, some ambition and some skill, but we recognise we're probably not going to keep them forever because they will be attracted by a big salary, probably at somewhere like a big financial services institution. So we try and get them on that upward trajectory, use them and train them and give them some skill and experience. We benefit from that and they benefit from that, but we recognise we'll never keep them for the long term. But around that, we have to have standards, policies, processes, the right tooling. But we also have to back off some of that support to a third party as well, recognising that if there was a large-scale cyber attack at the university, 5 people are never going to be able to defend against that. So we need to outsource an element of that, and we need that scale at that point. So if we were to suffer a significant large-scale attack, we might spot the initial attack, but then we have resources that we can bring in. But really, we're trying in the team to recruit for someone that's really agile, adaptable, but is on that upward trajectory, recognising that we will get the best out of them, but add some real value to them early on in their career as well.
Because, that's a really valuable point there about partnership and outsourcing, because a small, medium enterprise won't have the budget to go and often create a brand new team or even bring in a high salary expert as a first step. So how important is it to find the right kind of partner that you can trust and also know that you're safe in the hands, that it's not going to cost you the earth?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely fundamental. Trust is one of the key things there, isn't it? Because when you're talking about cybersecurity and talking to a partner, you are giving them access to your network, to your sensitive data. You have to trust that they know what they're doing and that they will work in partnership with you. The likelihood is that when you need them, when you really need them, it's in your most dire moment because there has been an attack. So trust has to be there. No one organisation can operate just as an island when it comes to cybersecurity. There's a great sharing of information across the community. So when there's a certain type of attack, particularly a new type of attack, that information, that kind of fingerprint that I talked about before, that's shared and everyone then can consume that and use that to learn from that so that we can defend collectively against some of these threats. So picking the right partner that you trust, absolutely essential. Doesn't have to cost the earth, it can be affordable. And a lot of the improvements can be process and systemic. It doesn't have to always be big technology. There are certain things that can just be driven by process improvement, good documentation, good policies, backed up with the right level of technical security.
And something you mentioned earlier in terms of the people, so making sure that they are aware of what to do and, more importantly, what not to do.
Yeah.
So training and development is a key part of that.
Yeah, we talk quite a lot about a culture of cybersecurity. So the biggest weakness in any organisation, and I mean this with the greatest of respect to the people that work there, it takes one person to click on a link that can bring the whole organisation down. I might not have said it before, but 91% of attacks start with a phishing email. It's still a very successful way of targeting an organisation. An organisation like the University of Salford, over 3,000 employees, if you don't train those people to have the skill to spot the phishing link in the first place, then you're fighting an uphill battle. That puts the reliance on the technical controls then. It would be much better and easier to train people to spot the issues beforehand rather than deal with the fallout afterwards. So creating that culture of cybersecurity and cyber awareness is the most important thing. The best form of defence is the people don't click the links in the first place. Otherwise, that's when my team get involved when they do click the link, and we have to contain the attack at that point. So training people to understand good cybersecurity, not just clicking links, but sharing of information. What are the right security protocols to follow, etc. That's just as important, in fact, even more important than all of the technical stuff that we do.
And even more important is using an AI tool or solution that is verified and approved by the organisation, rather than bringing in the next new one that's just come out because it's shiny.
Exactly, and that's one of the things that I think GenAI is great and being used for great things, but organisations have to understand the right controls to put around it and seek the right advice and support from an organisation to say, this is what we want to achieve. How best do we go about that? Which is the right large language model to use? Which is the right way to use it? What policy should we put around it? What technical control should we put around it? And then use it to leverage the best of AI, but don't do it and allow it to be the Wild West and just let people go free for all and do whatever they like, because that way does lead to some issues. Getting the right consultancy and understanding the right tools to use, then you can safely and securely know that LLMs, generative AI, is being used in the right way.
I mean, for any business owner who's just focuses growth, scaling, being commercially successful and beating their competitors, I mean, as fascinating as it is in terms of what we've been talking about, it can be a bit fearful. It could make people scared. Yeah. What advice would you give to business owners who haven't really taken that step into cybersecurity right now?
Yeah, I guess when we're talking cyber and generative AI, I said before, every business is a digital business now, whether we like it or not. So if there are people burying their heads in the sand and just pretending that cybersecurity won't affect them, that's a massive risk. So if I look at a number of dark web leak sites, this is ransomware gangs that have successfully attacked an organisation. I could show you 10 leak sites now from 10 different groups, and it will be absolutely pepper potted with small to medium enterprises on there. And it will be, the ransom demand might be £50,000, but that might be, that will be a significant amount of money for those organisations. So anyone running an SME thinking cybersecurity will never affect me because we're too small, that's just not true. And I can prove that. We have the evidence to back that up. Then if we're thinking about generative AI, and we talked about some of the dark side of that, but we also started off on the benefits of it. And I guarantee those SMEs, their competitors will already be looking at how to leverage GenAI, what that means for their customers, how it makes them more efficient, how they can deliver better quality services, and how they can use that to grow their businesses. So if they're not thinking about it, they need to speak to somebody that can help start to structure just the best way to use generative AI in a safe and secure way. That's a given. But how can they leverage tools like that to actually grow their business, grow their revenue, improve customer service, etc.? Because that's what it's there for. That's the positives. I don't want the negatives to prevent people from exploring that. But they need
aware of them.
Exactly, and get the right advice from the right people.
I think we've talked about the dark web, probably just for those viewing and listening to our conversation. And there are some risks, inherent risks of just taking a peep in that
Right.
arena, especially if you want to travel places. Yeah, is that correct?
Yeah. So, you can't just go and access the dark web from a standard browser. You have to have a certain specific browser. But even if you had that browser and you just decided to try and access it, that doesn't make you safe and secure, and you're likely to then have some security challenges when accessing the dark web, unless you know how to secure your connection. So you may inadvertently become the victim of a cyber attack just by fact you're trying to access the dark web. There are suggestions that people accessing the dark web, if their data is divulged, that you end up on watch lists in various locations. There are some positives around the dark web in that it keeps your data safe and secure in terms of communication, but that's assumed that you know how to secure your connection in the first place. And if you don't, you could end up finding it very difficult to keep your information safe and secure.
And holidays might become a problem.
You might end up on a watch list somewhere because people might want to know why you're on the dark web and what you were doing there.
So, a very good reason not just to tinker, because you've got special access and licenses for that.
Exactly, yeah. And we use it to make sure we're monitoring so that if we have been breached, and you don't always know as an organisation when you've been breached. Previously, the mean time to detection was 200 odd days. So from the initial compromise to actually realising, so you could go a period of time without knowing. Hence why we monitor the dark web to see if any of our information is appearing on there. But we're also watching for new tactics and techniques, a bit like the one I talked about earlier. So we're using that to inform how we defend against it. There is no good reason for somebody else to just decide to go and have a browse around there. It is a dangerous place, and there are many deeper and darker places on there that I would suggest avoiding.
I think that's a very good health warning there. Right, definitely. I mean, it sounds like there must be times where you see the level of sophistication and innovation within that dark space that you're kind of thinking, wow, that's really quite innovative. Obviously, you can't disclose too much, but forget the next 18 months, 12 months. In the next few weeks, months, and probably 6 months, where's it all going?
I think we'll just see GenAI really continue to lower the entry point for cyber criminals. So by that, what I mean is, years ago, you used to have to be a real nerd. You had to understand coding, you had to understand the breadth of coding, you had to understand infrastructure, you had to know how all those things fitted together to actually deliver an attack and to be a credible hacker. Now, GenAI has lowered the entry point. I could teach you how to hack an organisation in about 25 minutes with no prior experience.
I don't want to be on the watch list.
Probably best avoided. But it's lowered that entry point.
Yeah.
So I think what we'll see is an increased prevalence in attacks because of that lower entry point. We're now seeing cyber as the forerunner to kinetic warfare. So the war between Russia and Ukraine maybe only started just over 2 years ago now. That's the kinetic warfare. The cyber warfare has been going on for 3 or 4 years in advance of the kinetic warfare. And Russia were attacking water supply, electricity supply, etc. in Ukraine for years and years in advance. They were gathering data. The more data they gather makes the kinetic warfare easier to manage and to plan. So we will continue to see big investments from nation states, not only around defence, but particularly cyber defence and cyber offence. And I think already, in the UK, we're seeing a massive investment in our cyber offensive capabilities. So I think what we're now seeing because of the geopolitical situation is a massive investment in those cyber defence and offensive capabilities. And GenAI will play a massive part in that. That is not going to go away. I think that will continue for years to come.
Sounds like in terms of career prospects, if you're thinking about a career, this is the one to be involved in because it's just starting.
Exactly. I think there's great opportunity for anyone interested in big data, generative AI, cybersecurity in general, and especially where all three of those things meet, there are huge opportunities, and I think there'll be career prospects for somebody in that field for years and years to come.
Mark Wantling, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for taking time out because I know there's a lot going on behind the scenes. So thank you for your time today and sharing some insights that will no doubt help business leaders.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.